A young priest had no idea he was being recorded by cameras inside the church, and he did something unbelievable. When everyone saw the footage, they were left in shock. Fresh out of seminary, young Father Larry was assigned to a small church in a town where everyone knew each other. His arrival stirred curiosity and, above all, distrust among the older residents, who saw him as too inexperienced to lead a parish. The church, an old but well-maintained building, was the center of the community and carried memories of the previous priest, who had served there for many years. The contrast between the charisma of his predecessor and Larry's youth was evident, fueling the whispers and suspicious glances that followed him everywhere. Many locals whispered among themselves, doubting that this young man could counsel an entire community and understand their needs. Others simply watched, waiting for time to reveal who he truly was. Despite this, Larry dedicated himself to his tasks, taking care of the church and slowly trying to gain everyone's respect, though the weight of expectations and the lack of welcome made him feel out of place. It was a Sunday morning, and Mass at the small church had proceeded as usual. Father Larry concluded with his soft yet firm voice, wishing the congregation a blessed week. People began to leave in silence or exchanged brief greetings. Some, more kindly, approached Larry, shaking his hand with a shy smile, while others simply left without making contact. As usual, Larry remained near the altar, observing the tired faces and slow movements of his community. Jonathan, a respected merchant known for his rigidity, was among those leaving. Beside him, his daughter Emily walked with light steps and an attentive gaze. Suddenly she stopped and looked at her father. "Dad, I'm going to talk to the priest and ask for some advice," Emily said firmly. Jonathan frowned, briefly gripping his daughter's arm. "The priest? What for? He's too young, girl. What advice could he give you?" "He's the priest, Dad," Emily insisted. "I just want to talk about some things that have been bothering me." Jonathan scoffed in disbelief. "Fine. I'm going home. Don't take too long, okay? And be careful with your ideas." "Yes, Dad, don't worry," she answered with an almost innocent smile. Her father watched her for a moment, then nodded and headed home, leaving Emily free. She turned and walked up to the altar, where Larry was still collecting some items from the Mass. "Good morning, Father," Emily said as she approached. Larry looked up and smiled politely. "Good morning. Do you need anything?" "I wanted to talk, if you have some time," she replied, clasping her hands respectfully in front of her. "I wanted to ask for some advice." Larry nodded without hesitation. "Of course, that's what I'm here for. Shall we sit over there?" He pointed to one of the pews in the church. They walked together and sat down. Larry looked at her gently, waiting for her to start. "My name is Emily," she said, breaking the initial silence. "I think you've seen me here a few times. I've been a bit confused with life stuff and thought maybe I could talk to you." "It's a pleasure, Emily," the priest responded calmly. "And of course you can tell me anything. Sometimes talking helps more than we think." And so the conversation began. Emily spoke lightly at first, touching on simple topics like insecurities and future dreams. Larry listened attentively, offering words of comfort and advice based on the teachings of the church. When the conversation ended, Emily smiled. "I really enjoyed talking to you, Father. I think I'll come by more often." "You will always be welcome," Larry responded sincerely. In the following days, Emily kept her promise. She began visiting the church regularly, always finding ways to be alone with Larry. Sometimes she told her father she was going to pray. Other times she mentioned other commitments to avoid Jonathan questioning her frequent trips to the church. "You've been going out a lot, Emily," her father remarked one day. "Where have you been going so often?" "Praying is good, Dad," she quickly replied. Meanwhile, Larry felt divided. He always greeted Emily with the same kindness, but the frequency of her visits and the light yet curious tone of their conversations began to unsettle him. She spoke of life outside the church, of experiences he had never known. His youth and lack of worldly experience made him vulnerable to her constant and warm presence. One morning, as they sat on one of the pews, Emily leaned toward him. "You're so serious, Father," she said with a playful smile. "Don't you ever think about what's outside the church?" Larry looked away and replied in a controlled voice, "My place is here, Emily. It's where God placed me and where I must stay. But don't you miss discovering new things, meeting new people?" Larry was silent for a moment, feeling something stir within him, a feeling he didn't want to admit. "We all have our missions, Emily. Mine is to serve God." The days continued like this, with Emily getting closer and closer, and Larry trying to ignore the growing conflict inside him. One day the church was silent and empty, as it often was. Emily had arrived just before, and the two of them were sitting, talking as usual. The soft light of the late afternoon entered through the windows, gently illuminating Emily's face. Larry, sitting with his usual posture, listened as she spoke of trivial things, a book she had read, something curious she saw around town. But that afternoon, Emily's tone was different, softer, yet firmer at the same time. When she paused, she looked at him in a way that made Larry feel something twist inside his chest, an unease he didn't want to acknowledge. "Father," she began, her voice low but steady. Larry turned his gaze to the windows, trying to maintain control. "What's wrong, Emily? You seem troubled." She took a deep breath as if summoning courage and looked him directly in the eye. "I need to tell you something I've been feeling for a while. Since we started talking, I've started to enjoy being here, being with you, and now I think I feel something stronger, something beyond friendship." Larry froze for a moment, as though her words had hit him full force. Quickly, he raised one hand, a gesture meant to contain the situation before it slipped out of control. "Emily, be careful with what you're saying. Remember where we are. We are just friends, right?" "Friends?" she repeated with a light but sad smile. "You know it's not just that." Larry frowned and shook his head firmly, as if trying to push away her words and his own emotions. "No, Emily. We can't even think like that. This isn't right. I'm a priest. My commitment is to God." Your commitment," Emily replied, leaning slightly toward him, "doesn't erase what's here." She placed a hand over her chest. "I feel something for you, Father. Something I know you feel too, even if you don't want to admit it." Larry stood up abruptly, almost tripping as he stood. His face was visibly shaken, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Stop this, Emily. You don't understand what you're saying. I've made vows of chastity, of total devotion to the church. That feeling, if it exists, is a temptation, a test I must overcome." "A test," Emily repeated, her voice trembling slightly, but without losing its firmness. She also stood, facing him with determination. "Then why do you listen to me? Why do you let me come here every day? Why do you care so much about me, Father? Look at me and tell me you feel nothing. Look into my eyes." Larry hesitated, his hands trembling. The silence of the church seemed to shout around him, suffocating. He finally raised his face, looking at her. "I can't, Emily, I shouldn't." "But you want to," she insisted, stepping a little closer. "Don't lie to yourself. You're young, Father. You're human. You've spent your whole life locked in the seminary, never knowing the world, the people, true feelings. I chose this path," he said, his voice choking. "I chose to serve God because he called me. I can't let myself be swayed. I can't betray my vocation." "Betray?" Emily sighed in frustration. "And what's wrong with feeling, with being honest with yourself? You can't say that God doesn't want us to be truthful with what we carry inside." Larry put his hands on his head, as if trying to push her voice away. Enough, Emily. You don't understand. All of this is wrong. It shouldn't have started. I should have realized sooner that our conversations were going too far. I'm weak. I'm failing my faith. Emily came closer, slowly. Her face was serious now, her eyes fixed on the priest. It's not weakness, Larry. It's just being human. Why are you so afraid? Of me, of yourself? Look around you. The church is empty. There's no one here to judge you, just the two of us. Just what we feel. Don't say that, Larry exclaimed, almost in a whisper of desperation as he stepped back. Please, Emily, I can't. I don't want to. Then tell me you feel nothing, she challenged. Be honest with me now. Say I'm just a friend and that you don't think about me when you're alone here in the silence of this church. Larry opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He seemed stuck, torn between what he believed was right and what his heart, inexperienced and fragile, began to scream. His silence was enough for Emily. See, you can't say it because you feel, Larry, because you see me. Larry shook his head again, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Emily, I beg you, go home. Forget all of this. Don't come back here. It's not that simple, she whispered, stepping even closer until she was just a step away from him. And you know it. Don't do this, Larry murmured, his voice almost fading. Please, Emily, think of me. Think of what's happening. You can't. But Emily didn't step back. Instead, she raised her hand and gently touched Larry's face. He trembled at the touch, paralyzed. Then, without another word, she leaned forward and kissed him. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Larry stood still, his eyes wide, but his youth, his lack of experience, and the weight of everything he had been repressing was stronger than his reason. In a moment of weakness, he closed his eyes and returned the kiss. The kiss lasted only a few seconds, but to Larry it felt like an eternity. When he regained his senses, he pushed Emily away brusquely, his eyes wide and his hands shaking. No, no, Emily, he said, his voice trembling and desperate. He stepped back, stumbling into the pew behind him. What? What have we done? This couldn't have happened. Emily looked at him in surprise but remained calm. Father, breathe. Nothing major happened. It was just... No! Larry shouted, putting his hands on his head as if trying to contain a whirlwind of thoughts. You don't understand. This was a sin, a horrible sin. Here, inside the church. My God, what did I do? Everything I've built, everything I've fought for, thrown away. Emily moved closer, trying to speak in a softer tone. Larry, stop torturing yourself. You're exaggerating. We're just two people, that's all. There's nothing that wrong with this. Don't say that, he interrupted, his voice breaking. Larry began pacing back and forth like a man on the brink of collapse. I'm a priest, Emily. I made vows that pledged my faith to God. How could I be so weak? How did I let this happen? Stop torturing yourself, Emily insisted, now firmer. She moved toward him again, but Larry raised his hand, signaling her not to come closer. Go home, Emily, please go. Larry, please, he shouted, almost pleading, his tears threatening to fall. I need to think, alone. Go home, and don't come back, not today. Emily hesitated, looking at him for a few seconds. She opened her mouth to say something else, but stopped when she saw the desperation on Larry's face. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the church, where she stopped for a moment, looking back. Larry was kneeling, his face buried in his hands, murmuring prayers that were barely understandable. With a deep sigh, Emily left, closing the door softly behind her. In the days that followed, Larry could barely look at himself in the mirror. The weight of his sin seemed to crush his shoulders, and the church he once loved now seemed like a hollow and oppressive place. He prayed without ceasing, seeking some form of absolution for the mistake he had made, but the words seemed empty. Emily's face and the moment of the kiss kept coming back to him repeatedly, like an echo he couldn't silence. "My God, why did I let this happen? Why am I so weak?" he murmured in the long, lonely nights, sitting on the church pew with candles around him casting trembling shadows on the stone walls. Meanwhile, Michael, the church security guard, was in his small room reviewing the routine footage. He did this every week, more out of habit than necessity, since nothing unusual ever happened in the peaceful church. That afternoon, however, something caught his attention. He saw the recording from the day Emily had visited Father Larry. In the video, Larry seemed nervous, pacing back and forth, while Emily approached him, saying something Michael couldn't hear. The movement caught his attention, and he began watching more closely. "What is this?" Michael muttered, furrowing his brow. He rewound the video slowly, seeing the exact moment when Emily approached Larry and kissed him. His eyes widened, and he let out a muffled, "My God!" in disbelief. "No, this can't be," he whispered, rewinding the video several times, as if he needed to confirm that he wasn't imagining things. The priest, the girl, this is impossible. Still shocked, Michael leaned back in the chair, breathing deeply. He sat there for a few minutes, motionless, before pulling out his phone and transferring the video. "No one will believe this. Not even my wife." That night, Michael came home earlier than usual. His wife, Charlotte, was in the kitchen preparing dinner when he entered with a serious expression on his face. "What happened, Michael? Did something go wrong?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "You won't believe what I saw today," he replied, pulling the phone from his pocket and sitting at the table. "What did you see? Just say it, man." Michael sighed, looking at his wife with a grave expression. "It's something that's going to shake the whole town, something that I don't even know how to say." Charlotte crossed her arms, impatient. "Just say it already." Michael opened the video and handed her the phone. "See for yourself, but prepare yourself." Charlotte grabbed the phone and pressed play. At first she didn't quite understand, but then she saw the kiss. She went silent, mouth open, and when the video finished, she stared at her husband in shock. "I knew it!" she exclaimed, handing the phone back. "I knew you couldn't trust a priest that young. Look at what he's doing inside the church. How embarrassing." "Don't spread this, Charlotte," Michael begged, his voice almost pleading. "This could cause a lot of problems." "Of course, I won't say anything," she replied, already getting up to grab the phone again. "I'll just tell Isabella. She's my trusted friend. She won't tell anyone." Michael hesitated, but eventually agreed. "Only Isabella, then. No one else." Charlotte, however, didn't take long to send the video to Isabella the next day, convinced that a trusted friend would keep the secret. Isabella watched the video with the same shock and indignation, and although she promised to remain silent, the scene seemed to burn in her mind. By the end of the afternoon, when she visited Charlotte's mother to drop off some deliveries, the subject came up. Over coffee and conversation about the church, she couldn't resist and, in a hushed gossip tone, mentioned the video and briefly showed it on her phone. Charlotte's mother, a grey-haired lady with always attentive ears for community gossip, was stunned. Although she disapproved of the priest's actions, her indignation was tempered by the excitement of having such an absurd and scandalous story in her hands. When a neighbor came to pick her up to go to the market, the lady mentioned the video, almost casually, as if testing the waters to see her friend's reaction. That night, the neighbor couldn't resist and showed the video to her husband, who then forwarded it to one of his close friends' message groups. It was one of those typical groups in a small town where people discussed everything, from birthdays to everyday happenings. The caption was short but enough to spark curiosity. "Did you see what the priest did in the church?" In a few hours, the video began circulating from phone to phone, jumping from one group to another like wildfire. A merchant showed it to his wife, who passed it to a co-worker the next day. The news, combined with the video, started to turn into something bigger than just gossip. It became the scandal of the year. Soon, the ladies of the church were whispering on street corners, while the young people, with the irreverence of those who have no filters, shared the video more openly, laughing and exchanging incredulous looks. Every time the video changed hands, it gained new interpretations and judgments, but the impact was always the same: shock, disapproval, and outrage. Slowly, the news reached Jonathan. He was sitting at home, resting after a long day at work, when a notification arrived in the community group he followed. At first, he thought it was just another trivial message or a joke, but the title caught his attention. When he opened the video, he saw his daughter's face next to the priest. The shock was immediate, like a punch to the chest. Jonathan watched again, trying to find a logical explanation for what he was seeing, but the image was too clear. His expression hardened, his eyes fixed on the screen, his hands trembled with rage and disbelief, and for a moment he just stood still, staring at the phone as if he were waiting for it to disappear. His heart pounded in his chest, his head filled with questions, but one thing he knew for sure: this couldn't stay like this. "Emily!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the house. The bedroom door opened quickly, and Emily came running down the hallway, startled by her father's tone. "What is it, Dad? Did something happen?" Jonathan raised the phone toward her, the video still open on the screen. This happened!" he roared. Emily froze, staring at the phone with her heart racing. Her eyes widened in shock. "How? Who filmed this?" she muttered, more surprised than anything else. "What matters to me is what you were doing in there, inside the church," Jonathan yelled, stepping toward her with firm steps. "Is this true, Emily? Tell me the truth. Don't you dare lie to me." She swallowed hard, looking at her father with tears in her eyes. "Yes, Dad, it's true." Jonathan took a step forward, his face more contorted. "What? But it was me," she continued quickly, trying to explain. "I kissed the priest. It was me who did this. He didn't do anything. It was my fault." "I don't care," Jonathan screamed, throwing the phone onto the sofa. "I don't want to know who started this. This is absurd. A priest, Emily, a priest inside the church." He turned on his heel and marched toward the door, grabbing the keys with trembling hands. Dad, please, what are you going to do?" Emily cried, running after him. "I'll sort this out with that priest," Jonathan snarled, not looking back. "No, Dad, please don't do anything. You don't understand." Jonathan opened the door with force, almost tearing it off its hinges, and stormed out into the street, leaving Emily behind, crying and screaming at him not to go. He ignored everything, his blood boiling, determined to confront Larry. The church was nearly deserted, the candles already snuffed out and the silence dominating the atmosphere. Larry was kneeling near the altar, praying softly, still consumed by the guilt of the past few days. His cassock was wrinkled, and his deep, dark circles betrayed sleepless nights. The abrupt sound of the main door opening made Larry jump to his feet. Jonathan entered with firm steps, his eyes glowing with fury. "Father Larry!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the walls of the church. Larry turned, surprised and confused. "Mr. Jonathan, what is it?" "You know exactly what it is," the man shouted, quickly closing the distance, fists clenched. "I saw. Everyone saw, you bastard. How dare you do this with my daughter inside the house of God?" "What are you talking about?" Larry asked, stepping back a little, confusion clear on his face. "Don't play innocent," Jonathan roared, pointing an accusing finger. "The cameras, it was all recorded, the kiss, everything." Larry stopped, as if the ground had opened up beneath him. "Cameras," he murmured, almost voiceless. "What cameras?" "Oh, so you didn't even know you were being filmed, huh?" Jonathan continued, his voice laden with sarcasm and rage. "Well, everyone saw, Father, everyone. You and my daughter, here, in the church, a sacred place. Larry went pale, feeling the world spinning around him. No, this can't be true. He put his hands on his head, his breathing growing more irregular. My God, what have I done? Don't you feel any shame? Jonathan screamed, advancing even more. I trusted you. We trusted you. And this is how you repay us, seducing my daughter. No! Larry exclaimed, trying to defend himself, tears already beginning to fall down his face. No, it wasn't like that. Emily was the one who... I don't care who started it, Jonathan interrupted, pounding his fist against the pew with such force that the sound echoed. You're the priest. It was your duty to push her away. It was your duty to protect my daughter, not fall into temptation like an immature boy. Larry dropped to his knees, desperate. I know I failed. I'm weak. I'm a sinner. My God, what did I do with my life? This isn't enough, Jonathan growled, his voice now lower but full of fury. I'll demand you be removed from this church. You don't deserve to wear that cassock. You don't deserve it. The confrontation between Jonathan and Larry was just the beginning of the end. The news of the video, now spread throughout the town, took on even greater proportions. Many families stopped attending the church, saying the place had been desecrated. The community was divided. Some blamed Larry, others blamed Emily, but everyone felt betrayed. The ladies who had once prayed daily now whispered reproachfully in corners. Larry was called by the diocese a few days later. Consumed by guilt and shame, he accepted the decision without protest. He would be removed from the parish. On the last day he was in the church, he walked alone to the altar, where he knelt in silence, tears rolling down his face. Emily, in turn, faced judgment at home. Jonathan barely looked at her, and conversations at home were cold and dry. The community isolated her as well, whispering about the girl who brought shame. Emily cried alone in her room, feeling the weight of the consequences of her choices. The church remained empty in the following days, a symbol of silence and division. The altar, once a refuge of peace, now seemed a cold and distant place. Michael, the security guard, continued his work, but avoided looking at the cameras, feeling partially guilty for starting the chain of gossip. Larry left the town on a grey morning, carrying only a suitcase and the weight of a bitter lesson. He didn't know where he was going, just that he needed to start over. The church, once filled with murmurs of prayers, now held only murmurs of what had once happened. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.